Hi, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Amanda Cooper, and I'm a senior partner in Lightbox Collaborative, and I am video conferencing, zooming in from Alameda, California, which is right next to Oakland. It is the ancestral home of the Ohlone and Chochenyo people, and you can use she, her pronouns for me. And I'm really excited to be here talking with you. We are talking about the question of, is this a crisis? And this is near to my heart because as a communications professional for the last couple of decades, unfortunately, I've seen my fair share of crisis communication situations. I've been a consultant for the last 10 years, but before that, I was working with the union. I was at the Brennan Center for Justice. I was at a children's services agency and a food bank, and all of these different organizations have their own versions of crisis. And so I'm excited to share what I've learned through those processes and through those experiences with you today.
Oh, Amanda, it's such a pleasure to share a virtual space with you. My name is Anna Castro. You can use any pronouns with me. I am based in Austin, Texas, ancestral home of the Tonkawa people. My background as a communications strategist began at the ACLU of San Diego. I have worked at Mi Familia Vota and Transgender Law Center. And as a consultant and collaborator with Lightbox, I've had the pleasure of working on issue areas that are near and dear to my heart, like immigrants' rights, racial justice, LGBTQ liberation, and civic engagement work. My vantage point from crisis communications and for rapid response really comes from the fact that, for communicators, particularly communicators that are directly impacted by the issues that they are working on, there is a whole nother layer to crisis communications and rapid response. Some of us are very comfortable with crisis because it is something that we have to navigate in our everyday lives. That doesn't mean that it doesn't leave a very real physical and mental toll. And I hope that we are able to talk about some of that today while offering you some ways of doing the amazing work that you do. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We would love to learn more about you. You will also see when we pull up our presentation soon what our handles are on Twitter and ways of staying in touch with us. So please, this is going to be a session in which we want to learn, we want to teach, and we want to learn. And we know that the way that we do that is by communicating with each other. So with pulling our presentation up, and I'll give it a second. So it's written pretty in pretty small font, but Amanda, do you want to give the ways that folks can engage us on for Lightbox?
Yes, I'm sorry, I tried to fix this, but this platform made these smalls. But the collaborative, our Twitter handle is at LBCollab, COLLAB, and I'm at Mandacoop. So that's MANDACOOP, and Anna is at APCastro16. And we also, you can reach me by email at amanda@lightboxcollaborative.com, and we will share those at the end as well. Hey, Elliot, great to see you. Nice, I'm seeing some folks in the chat I know. So also put in the chat, like if there's, if you have a burning question as we start this session, something you really want to hear us address as we're talking today, and as questions come up, please also add them to the chat, and we will try to address them as we move through. All right, so moving on.
So we want to say, first of all, when we're talking about crisis communications and rapid response, we know that we are sitting at our computers and putting out some metaphorical fires that are happening through our emails and through checking out what is happening on Twitter and on social media. So I want to invite y'all to take this moment to make sure your feet are touching the ground, that if you're someone that likes to fiddle with things, that you've got something fun to fiddle with, because we want to take down the emotional intensity in the room for a bit. And so on our next slide, you can see our intention with this session is to navigate again what rapid response and crisis communications means, offering some best practices, etc. But we also, this is really a moment to ground ourselves and know that the crisis is not happening right now in this room. Looking at this amazing picture of water just allows us to ground ourselves in the fact that When we're engaging in crisis and rapid response, our whole nervous system is going through a ride, and giving this metaphor of water, moving constantly, making changes, all of that, allowing us to settle ourselves into our intention today. And what is our intention today? So first of all, communications inspo goals, Olivia Pope, from Scandal, a Shonda Rhimes favorite. We just wanted to say that our goals for this session are: 1, to develop your organization's criteria for engaging in crisis communications and rapid response. Amanda is going to offer some amazing tips on how to really narrow down on what you need to work on, and things that, yes, may activate us, but do not fall under the realm of things that we need to engage in. We are also going to be sharing some best practices for responding to crisis and rapid response moments. And lastly, we want to build your organization's comfort in navigating tough moments, including supporting as in you that are here with us in this room, your sustainability and wellness. We know that it is tough to be a communicator out there these days. Yes, some of the challenges are the same. Yes, we have some of the same villains, but this media landscape and how we engage in it has changed. The level of polarization on our Twitter feeds has definitely fed into some doom scrolling, as they call it. But for us, it's really sometimes just researching what is going on in the world. So we want to really embed in this, just bringing back the question to how do we make this sustainable, and how do we embed practices of wellness as you engage in this work. And Amanda, handing it off to you.
Thanks, Anna. So, you'll recall that the name of this session is this a crisis? And yes, we're going to give you a lot of tips on crisis communications, but and how to differentiate between a crisis opportunity and a rapid response opportunity, and when to respond. But there's a reason why this distinction between is this a crisis or not really matters. And it kind of goes back to our little dog in the fire, right? Because if you're constantly in crisis such that you start to have to pretend like you're not in crisis, right? That is not a healthy way to work. We get emotionally activated when we're in crisis. And again, it doesn't matter, as long as you feel like it's a crisis, that emotional activation happens, right? It's not a matter of, it's that crisis is an experience, right? It's not an objective fact. So, trying to get out of the feeling of being in crisis all the time is critical, because again, that emotional activation is stressful, it's harmful to our bodies, but also we don't do our best work, right? We're distracted, we're scared, and we're not as smart. It kicks in our lizard brain. That's why there's a lizard picture there, right? That gut brain, the one that's not capable of higher processing. So you want to not feel like a lizard. You want to be your full self, and be able to bring that to the work as much as possible. Because also going from crisis to crisis exhausts us, and it can really contribute to burnout. And we need to our fights are long-term fights. This is not a short-term process. We want to be able to sustain ourselves for the long term. And another reason why you have to really try to de-escalate some crises is because this is a strategy that our enemies use to make us less effective. They distract us with, nonsense, basically, to try to get us to focus on what they want us to focus on, as opposed to kind of doing our work. So that's another reason why it becomes really important to be able to know the difference in your work between what is an actual crisis that needs a crisis response, and what is something that is just kind of the result of you doing your job. A few years ago, at the kind of beginning of the Trump, I don't want to call it an era, I want it to be shorter than that, but at the beginning of, when Trump arrived on the scene and started saying a lot of terrible things about immigrants, we were running a training for immigrants' rights organizations. And, we found that the distraction of, of people wanting them to respond to every statement, to every tweet, to the press reaching out to these well-known organizations about how they felt about it, was really keeping them from their work. Because as much as Trump was a crisis for our communities, it was also not germane to their everyday work necessarily. They had, people to, help file paperwork. They had people, they had things to do, and responding to every Trump tweet or, taking a media call for it wasn't necessarily the best way to spend their time. So we developed this kind of rubric for them. So, because to say that it wasn't a crisis, what was happening in the national media around immigration was not accurate, right? That was a crisis. But is it your crisis, right? And so that was the question we tried to ask people. And we have a blog post about this that we can share afterwards if you, that kind of talks you through this process. So, is it a crisis? And there's some criteria questions in there. If it's not, get back to work because your work is important. If it is a crisis, there's this question of whether it's your crisis. And we really define, you'll see Anna's questions about what make it an organizational crisis, your crisis that you have to deal with. And if that's the case, then you need to kick into crisis mode and either try to fix it, right? Solve the problem and avert the crisis, spin it if it's a situation in which you can try to drive the narrative. And we'll give some examples of that. Or, own up and change, be accountable and recognize that your organization has done something wrong and here's how you're going to fix it. So we'll give you more background on this, but just this can be a helpful conversation starter about how to avoid jumping to every, moment.
Thanks,
so what is an
Amanda.
organizational crisis, Anna?
It comes down to this thing that we all have, and we all want to have a good one of it, and it is reputation. So an organizational crisis, a couple of different ways of thinking about it is one, it's a crisis when an organization's actions or a member of the organization does not live up to their stated values. Next, it's when an organization or a member of the organization is attacked for their values. And lastly, when harm has come to your constituents or the community you work with. And, just to think through some of the examples that we've seen, we're communicators, which means we're really plugged into what is happening in the world. We've seen this play out in our social media a few times in the last year. It comes down to organizations that are reckoning with a legacy of anti-Black racism. It comes down to organizations that are reckoning with, toxic work environments or perhaps leadership that is enabling toxic work environments. On the other end, it is also about organizations that are stating political values that make them the target of an opponent. Folks that are stating their support for the liberation of Palestinian people, people that are organizing from a particular faith. Everything from, talking about reproductive justice, folks that are being 100% unapologetically pro-abortion. So you can see with an organizational crisis, again, it's about reputation. And sometimes it is about a reputation that you have earned, one in which you have, again, like Amanda said, it's like, this is something that has happened. And at other times, it is an unexpected moment that is coming about because political circumstances have changed. And so in our next slide, let's talk about what isn't an organizational crisis. What isn't a crisis is one, a legislator votes the wrong way on a bill you are supporting. That's more a part of the work that we've done. That could be a part of a rapid response moment, but it's not necessarily about your reputation as an organization or your leadership's reputation. Next, you don't get a grant. Again, this could be an operational crisis. It is not necessarily a communications crisis yet. And lastly, your opponent says bad things about you. Amanda and I were talking about this, very recently, and we we're saying sometimes it is a crisis, but it's a crisis that can have a potentially, it hides a potential opportunity. Things like, Elizabeth Warren's "nevertheless, she persisted." Things like the concept of being called a nasty woman. There are moments when your opponents are saying bad things about you because you are doing the work that you are supposed to be out there doing. You are repelling the opposition. So is this an organizational crisis? No, but there is obviously a potential for some work that needs to be done there. And then I want to, when thinking about organizational crises, I see from the comments that a lot of folks, have dealt with their fair share of crises. And people are, again, referencing the stress management component to it. And so I just wanted to talk about like what escalates a crisis. It's sometimes, the other barometer of like what is going to make your heart, beat ever so much faster and give you that anxiety sweat. So here are some criteria for like what kind of crisis are we dealing with? The first question, you want to ask yourself, is it true? And, I just want to admit in that sometimes that isn't necessarily going to matter. You may not actually know because there is perception versus reality. But it is still a question to ask yourself. It involves some investigation on your part. The second, who knows about it? Is this crisis happening because a reporter is knocking on your door, metaphorically, or is it happening because you found out through having a well-oiled internal communications protocol that something may be coming up? Next, another question to ask yourself. Do the people who know about it, or soon will, have power over your organization or your community? Can they affect your ability to do your work? Because as we stated before, we know our opposition doesn't like us. What they know and what they think about us and how they spin it, while there is a very important body of work that goes into, again, like tipping over from crisis communications to anything that endangers people's safety, as in doxing and all of that. Like I want to put that in a separate bucket for right now. But when we're talking about, is this a crisis? If our opposition continues to dislike us and has a new reason for disliking us, that is very different than our community losing faith in us. It is very different than, a situation in which your leadership is being attacked for having expressed a political opinion. So those are different. Who knows? What power do they have? Does it affect your ability to do your work? Next, is there a legal element? Is this an HR issue? That absolutely impacts, when thinking about your communications response, what you may or may not be able to say. Next, is there money involved? Whose money? These are, again, these questions just change who needs to be in the room when you're thinking through your crisis response. Next question, is this a contained event or something ongoing? As in, what is the length of this potential crisis? Is it an isolated incident that has happened previously? Is it something that is ongoing? Is it something that may happen? Unfortunately, that just dictates how much monitoring you're going to have to do. And then lastly, are members of staff or leadership involved? And in that, I'll include your board. Who is involved in this situation definitely escalates the perception of how much the organization is involved and how much backlash you can expect the organization to receive. And so with that, in this session, we want to do some storytelling with you, and we want to share some of the things that we have seen, we have experienced in terms of crisis moments, and also share some of the takeaways. And so I know that likely this is like part of the conversation where you're like, ooh, I'm thinking about these crisis moments that I've had to handle, and now I'm getting a little bit nervous. But again, take this as a moment to be like, the crisis is not happening now. This is an opportunity to dissect, to think through what you did well and what you would like to change for the future. And we're going to walk you through how we've done that for ourselves. So Amanda, tell me about the crisis you've dealt with.
Thanks, Anna. And I just want to acknowledge Robin's question. How do you get an organizational leader or principal who thinks that everything that happens in the world necessitates an organizational response? To recognize that not everything's in our lane and requires a response. And if we treat everything as a crisis, and our members won't actually see anything as a crisis, which is a great observation. So we definitely have some tips from that in the that blog post I mentioned earlier, and then another one, and the protocols that we're going to share. But to get started with that, we're going to kind of tell our own stories about how we've dealt with this within organizations. So as I mentioned, I was the press secretary and eventually communications director for an international labor union for a few years. And, we were a collection of locals throughout the US and Canada. And not all of our local leaderships were on the up and up, unfortunately. This is a thing that happens anytime there's money and power involved, right? And so a few times during my tenure, we had situations where a local leader had, misappropriated, stolen, misused, there were different legal definitions, but basically where money was missing. And that's our members' money. That's their dues money. That's the money that they pay out of their checks to be represented. And so this is a serious crisis of values, right? We are not representing people well if we are not taking care of the money that they contribute to the union. In the worst case scenario, which was the first scenario, I would learn about this through the media. A reporter would call me and say, do you have a comment? And I would have to do kind of all that forensic work that Anna was talking about. Like, is this true? Where's this happened? How long have we known? To try to figure out what we could say about it. And the union's approach for years had been, because oftentimes it was our own checks and balances within the organization that surfaced this crisis, right? We discovered that this was happening through our own due diligence. And that's actually a good service. That means the union is doing its job, right? You can't guarantee that people aren't going to misbehave, but you can be sure that you have systems in place to make sure that when that happens, it's stopped. And we did have those systems in place, but unions have, are embattled all the time. People are always trying to undermine our strength and the service that we provide, or and the unity, then the service that we provide working people. And so, no one really wanted to talk about this, which I understood. But by not talking about it, then I was caught off guard. The members would hear about it from the media, right? And it would make a bad problem worse. And so over time, I was able to convince the leadership of the union that, in fact, we needed to announce these ourselves, believe it or not, when we discovered them, so that we could control the narrative, so that we could tell the story, so that we could talk about how we discovered these problems through our own internal processes. And also that way we could speak directly to members from the messengers they trust. So it's like choosing the right messengers, right? You want to make sure that the members whose money was at risk didn't learn about this from the local paper. They learned about it from their business agents and their union reps, right? And we had to think about, we also sometimes, if we didn't catch something, we had to talk about, we wanted to be like, here's what we're putting in place, right? Here's how we're changing this so this can't happen again. And we always led with our values. This is our members' money. Our members' money comes into the board, into the union, so that the members can be represented and do the political work that's so important to them. And we always wanted to put our members first. So we eventually, like I say, we pivoted from hiding when these stories came out to saying like, hey, guess what? Our processes worked. We found a bad actor and we've changed. And we've taken care of it. If you have any questions, let us know. And we would distribute that message again throughout the leadership so people could hear it from people they trusted.
Amanda, I have a question for you in that. And I think it goes back to, bringing in some of what Robin is saying too about how do you convince organizational leadership of a particular approach? How did you, based on, the worst case scenario, finding something out from a reporter directly, how did you convince people to buy into a system in which there was more open and transparent communication?
Well, yeah. I mean, basically, unfortunately, in this case, we had to have a couple of bad stories, right? And, when we said, and the stories were bad, or times where people got calls and said no comment. I mean, this is what we're really trying to avoid, right? So, people would see the bad news and they'd say, okay, that isn't working. And so that gave us an opportunity to try something else. So, what I would say is that if you've had to do things a certain way and you can prove, and everybody knows it didn't work, that's a great opportunity to say, hey, how about we try this, And then also I think we treated it more like a campaign. The union really understands that you wanted to set the tone. You wanted to frame the campaign. And so I kind of tried to say, look, this is about framing this campaign. The campaign is preserving our reputation in the face of these challenges. And if we can get out and frame it, then we're going to have a better chance of winning this campaign. So I had to kind of use terms and techniques that they understood from other areas of the work.
Got it. No, that is really smart. I mean, again, you are creating effective internal messaging for why we need to motivate our staff to respond to things in a particular way.
Yeah. And so that's what I'd say to Robin too. It's like, I would show when, look, we did this rapid response. We put all this time into it. And it got, no shares and no likes, right? So why was that worth our effort? Probably not, So try to point to how it hasn't worked.
Yes. And I think that, thinking through, different types of crises, I want to bring in an experience that I had in the 2016 presidential election cycle. When I was working for a civic engagement organization, our bread and butter was our amazing voter registration efforts, nonpartisan voter registration efforts, particularly geared at communities that were under attack by then presidential candidate Trump. And so one of the things that, for me had been really important in terms of jumping into doing civic engagement work, and something that I recommend for anyone, like whatever issue area you jump into, I did some research before stepping into a role. I looked at what are the previous crises that have impacted my issue area. And in thinking about that, I understood a couple of different things. I was like, well, voter registration efforts have always been under attack, and are, registering people of color for whatever reason, side eye, is considered suspicious at any time. And also just understanding that there's been, repeated attempts and actual successful attempts at infiltration into our movement spaces. So when I one day receive a voicemail from a reporter asking me to comment on the fact that someone in an area in which we were doing our nonpartisan voter registration efforts had claimed that they had been registered to vote by us, and that their party affiliation had been changed from Republican to Democrat. When I got that voicemail, I immediately thought, like, firsthand, lockdown. I need to know, I need to be able to control what is happening and what we're going to respond. And that means I need to get in touch with anyone that could be potentially responding to this media request. Already in our organization, we had a very robust system of all media requests are vetted by the communications team. But I understand that during a campaign cycle, you want to get the word out. So you want to respond to any, calls that a reporter is giving. But I had already, like I said, had implemented that system. I wanted to double check that that was working. So I immediately, to the area in which this impacted, immediately called all leadership, immediately called my executive director and said, we've had this question come up. And we need to think through our response before we say anything. And that also led to, just another lesson of responding proportionately, in the sense that in that moment, I didn't immediately feel compelled to say, I need to respond to this. Our reputation is on the line. I didn't forget my organization's reputation overall. We have done amazing voter registration work for several years, have even gotten awards from, county registrars, all of that, because of the quality of our work. So this one allegation isn't going to make me automatically start to sound the alarm. It makes me sound the alarm internally into the organization, but it doesn't make me think I need to do something immediately. Everything is on the line. And so, one of the other things that I did was say, yes, we need to investigate what is happening. Everything that we do internally is going to feed into what we're able to say about this publicly. And so folks that are running voter registration efforts, all the communications folks, just knowing these are the systems that we have in place in every single one of our areas. We know what quality control looks like. We know what the training looks like. We know what every, parts of the operation look like. So we have trust in the fact that we know our folks are trained to do something. And this is also where, again, internal values of an organization come to the forefront, because I know that in a crisis, at times, the idea is deflect, point to a different villain, point to someone else. Within our organization, we had a very clear message of we are not judge, jury, and decider of what has happened in this situation. We are not going to be making that decision. We will get in touch with the people that make those types of decisions, but we're not throwing anyone under the bus. What kind of morale would that inspire in our organization if at the potential of an allegation, we start interrogating everyone about what has happened? And so some internal alignment around what our organizational values are, our internal reputation and external reputation. And luckily through that, also the last thing is I knew immediately, when the specter of any kind of impropriety comes along, I was we need to talk to an attorney. So let's bring in an attorney and let's start thinking through what we can say and what we can't say. And for those of you, I mean, I see that there are attorneys in the room, and my background is working with attorneys. So I will say this, it is always going to be a push or pull about like what it is that you can say and can't say publicly. It absolutely never hurts to have someone that is understanding of anything that can happen with the legal implications of a crisis to be in the room. And it's just about establishing lanes of consideration. Like, this is what you're going to bring into the space. This is what I'm going to bring into the space. Let's have an open and honest conversation about how we ensure that our work moves forward smoothly. And so for me, it was again about creating that internal infrastructure of the crisis of who are our decision makers, who are the folks that need to be kept in the know, and how do we communicate this out to staff in a way that allows this to not be happening in other places? We didn't know if we were under attack we didn't know if we had been infiltrated. We didn't know if this was something that could impact our operations in other places, but we wanted to make sure our staff would be prepared in terms of being able to handle that and know that there was an infrastructure in place that they could trust. So that's, a bit about that crisis. And like we've said before, I think we have maybe mentioned this before in other spaces, but like, a crisis being public versus a crisis being internally something that you're handling it, that may be the measure of like how successful you were. How many people did end up knowing about this? Right. And the last thing I'll say is like, we knew who we needed to get on our side in terms of this crisis, which was like, we don't want to harm our reputation and our, status as folks that are doing nonpartisan voter registration. So the validators that we really needed on our side, it was very, very important. Like, we knew that we needed to keep our relationships with our voter registrar intact. And that was something that we absolutely was like, that was our focus. There are many reasons why voter registration is consistently under attack when it comes to registering people of color. So that was something that like, yes, we could worry about, but what we knew at the end of the day is that we had a reputation for doing this work very well, and that we could move forward on that.
Anna, one question for you. I know one of my constant struggles is that if it were up to HR or the lawyers, we'd say nothing, right? Because from a legal standpoint, that's the safest, is to keep your mouth shut. But we know from a reputational standpoint, that can be extremely damaging. What are your tips for how to convince the lawyers, to work with the lawyer, the people who are trying to protect you legally versus the people who are trying to protect you reputationally? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I really like to bring it all to the table. It's like, let's establish what our goals are at the end of the day, and let's figure out how we can all, one, move in lockstep. So nobody is making any moves without the other person knowing. We're not posting anything. We're not saying anything until we've run through that scenario with our attorney, until we figured out exactly like what can be said, what can't be said. Again, the idea of no comment is something that like really comes up. Like, we can't say anything at all. And it's like, well, that may put into jeopardy anything else that we can do. So what can we do? And I think that's like what I always just say. I'm like, it is absolutely a good idea to have an attorney in the room when you are engaging in some of these moments. And it is also to have, establish like, hey, this is where I'm coming from this. How do we know when we can move into the stage of saying something? How do we vet anything by you?
Right. And Adam brings up a good point too, which is that, that might create that attorney-client privilege within that conversation. And I'll also recommend having these conversations by phone or in person whenever possible, because that makes it less discoverable. Meaning that, the attorneys don't ask for your emails, because nobody, trust me, you don't want your emails read by everyone in the world, no matter how careful you've been. So Anna and I've learned a lot from those experiences while they happened. But what the main thing I think we took away is like, wow, if we had some of these plans in place beforehand, this could have gone a lot better. And so here are sort of kind of the key steps we have, and you might want to screen cap this, or again, we'll send you the slides if you want them after the presentation. But you want to start with your imagination. right? Imagine what are the scenarios that in which you're vulnerable. You know, Anna was talking about, like, they were doing voter registration, like that's a, you know, they knew all the boxes literally that people needed to tick, and what could be, how they could be attacked. So kind of try to catalog those vulnerabilities and imagine the moments too that might be uncomfortable but not a crisis, right? So again, you know, the things where your opponents say something bad about you, and or your allies say something bad about you, right? But it's not really going anywhere. It's just a comment on your, you know, on a tweet thread. You know, that's not really a crisis, even though it doesn't feel good. And consider some, like, what are your must-do rapid response moments? What are moments in which you absolutely have to? Again, your community is directly impacted, or you know, or you need, or people are going to be looking to you, and we'll give you some established criteria for that. So establish that criteria. What's a crisis and what isn't? And then figure out who moves into action when it is a crisis. And again, it's that attorney. It is probably somebody from HR. It's also great to get somebody from outside of your particular bubble. You know, if you're an organization, maybe a board member, or you know, another trusted person, because they have some perspective that you don't have, right? When you're under attack, again, that lizard brain kicks in. Try to get somebody in the room who's not going to feel as personally threatened, to be kind of a litmus test for how proportionate your reaction is. Identify the different audiences who need to get the information and a strategy to reach them, including messengers. And this is what, you know, Anna and I were talking about in our stories. Like, if we could get to the members first and let them know what had happened with their leader and why, then this might never become a public story. It might just stay within the local. You know, in Anna's case, you know, she needs to make sure the registrar of voters still trusts them. That's best done with a phone call, right? Not with a tweet or a press release, right? So think about how, so, you know, again, thinking about how to deliver those messages to the right audiences, and not necessarily doing that as a broadcast strategy, maybe doing that as a one-on-one strategy. Develop those draft internal and external messaging. This is another way to help with the attorneys. If the messaging already exists for these scenarios and they've already had a chance to see it, then they're going to be more comfortable with it getting out. And this is basically how you avoid no comment. We're looking into this. We take this seriously. We have no reason to believe that there was any wrongdoing, but we certainly, you know, for the trust in our community, are going to find out. Those are all ways to say no comment, right? You're not saying anything. You're not admitting any guilt, but you're saying, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We are looking into it, because this is not how we want to be in the world, right? So have that ready. And have ideas, and then make sure you're scheduling a training with your staff or board or your volunteers or whoever you're working with, to know this process, know where to take concerns, right? Where to elevate stuff that they see in the field, who to refer media to, right? All of that stuff. Make sure your staff is all trained up on that. So yeah, Anna, you know, what changes did you all recommend as you went into the later cycles that you learned from that situation?
Definitely one of the things that we incorporated into is just consistently revisiting our protocols for how we communicate during high stress, high volume moments. We all know that they're like entering into a cycle. There are those moments where your phone is ringing nonstop and you're just trying to filter requests everywhere. So the other thing beyond that was also one of the things that I did immediately when I got that request from that reporter was research that reporter. I looked up, I'm like, what is their angle on this? What have they said before? How have they covered, you know, what is the tone that they're going to cover this with? And that was something that then we ended up like having be a part of the field work that everyone was doing. It's like, when you come in contact with a reporter, let's do a debrief on how it went with that particular reporter. Let's have some notes written in there so we know, like, hey, this is someone that, you know, requires more prep work on the communicators' end to ensure that they cover our issue area well. This is someone that has a very definitive angle to how they cover our issues. So that was some of the external work that we did. Like, again, reviewing consistently our internal communications protocol, and then ensuring that we kept track of reporters that were coming into our space. And also, I think for folks that are doing social media work, one of the other things that we did was just like institute just really being very mindful of our social media presences for anyone working on the campaign, anyone that we brought into our volunteer spaces, anything like that, because the best, offense is sometimes a very good defense, and just like not creating the opportunity for any distractions on our work.
Yeah. Cassidy's asking about, with social media, struggling to find the balance between being authentic and having clapbacks, especially on Twitter, while not always having a sense of urgency. And this is really, or get us in trouble for saying something our base disagrees with. This is really where having a strong sense of brand and brand personality, again, so that you can be values driven in your approach. But that's an excellent segue into thinking about. So again, if you've done this planning, you've figured out what's a crisis and what's not. And what's not a crisis may, though, be a rapid response opportunity. And how do you determine whether something is a rapid response opportunity? And again, we'll share a resource with a series of questions that you can work through with your organization, but they fall into a couple of buckets. First, why? Why do you need to respond to this? To what end? Are you trying to correct misinformation? Are you trying to just be clever? And is that on brand, right? And also, are you going to back it up? Like, whatever you're saying in this rapid response, are you signaling action? Thinking about audience. Does someone need to hear from us on the issue? And who and why us? Do they need to hear from us, or do they need to hear from someone? If they don't need to hear from you, then it might be that instead of you responding yourselves, you just amplify someone else's response, which can be just as important. And then capacity. Can we do this in a timely fashion? Is it more important than the work that we have to say no to in order to do it, right? And that's, I think, really the key question. And Robin, I think this can help you too. When your ED comes to you and says like, hey, we got to get a statement out on this. I always find it helpful to say, okay, if I do that, here's what I'm not going to do. Here's what deadline I'm not going to meet. And then the choice is up on them. Then they have to say like, oh, is this really enough of a priority to not get that grant proposal in, or to, not plan that legislative action day or whatever, like the thing that's actually affirmatively trying to get you into your win position, right? As opposed to your defensive position. So there's a bunch of questions here. And another thing I'd say about like capacity is that if it would take you a really long time to put together messaging for a rapid response, that probably means this isn't in your core area of work, right? And so it probably means that you are not the right people to speak on this, and the right thing to do is just to amplify. So again, if it's going to take you half a day to put together a response, as opposed to just grabbing from your talking points, because this is what you talk about all the time, that's a really good indicator of whether you should be having this conversation. Deborah's asking a question about, the marches last weekend banning the Handmaid's Tale style red cloaks. And, Deborah, it seems like you were part of that. And so you were, you didn't like that stance. And I guess I'm curious, like, is this a crisis for who? You have an opportunity to so maybe you can tell me, like, do you think it was a crisis for the Women's March because were you trying to escalate it for them because you felt like they were behaving not in their values? I'm thinking about the situation like with the Think Before You Pink folks, who remind folks that people like the Komen Breast Cancer Foundation taking money from Monsanto, who create cancer causing chemicals, right? So, that can be a moment where you want to point to someone and say, hey, this is not your values. So I'm curious if you were trying to escalate the crisis internally, or if you felt like it was a crisis for your own organization because you were being uninvited to a place where you want to be. And I think if that's the case, then, that's just an opportunity for you to reassert why you're doing the work that you're doing and why you think it's the right message. And, respectfully understand that if they disagree, but, not taking your eyes off of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. And
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Amanda. I was going to move into just talking about some of the criteria for rapid response.
Yep.
And, we wanted to give you an opportunity just to think through a decision flow chart and have something have this be something that you work on with the people in your organization that do communications work. So I wanted to, this is something, again, that you can screenshot. This is something that you can take, like, obviously tailor to your own. But as Amanda mentioned before, I think one of the key questions to ask yourself in a rapid response moment is this about our issue areas? And in some cases, that's a very clear yes or no answer. But, going down the pathway of, yes, it's a part of our issue areas. Some of us work in very big multi-issue organizations, which means, yes, it may be a part of our issue areas, but no, it's not necessarily a part of any of our ongoing campaigns. And so giving that, additional consideration of, does it impact, reinforce our current campaigns? And that having being another crossroads, another fork in the road of yes or no. If it is a full yes throughout the board, then like, yes, let's draft a plan and let's think through something proportional to the moment of what we can actually do. And one of the things I want to invite y'all to consider is, rapid response is a relay race. We do have the folks that are the frontline responders who are going to be on the ground and thinking through the 72-hour plan. Just as necessary and just as critical are the folks that are coming in afterwards to relieve our frontline folks or to amplify the messages of our frontline folks. And so, with thinking about like, no, it's not something that reinforces our current campaigns, that gives you an opportunity to pause and go back to your organization and say, hey, is this a moment for us to revisit some of the work that we haven't been doing lately, but to think about how this fits in? And then going back to the other end of this, it's not a part of our issue areas. Just bringing in that question that really helps us think through whether we're leading or amplifying is, does it impact our partner organizations? And in this case, being able to answer yes or no, having that be, if it's yes, it impacts our partner organizations, we amplify. That may also be an opportunity to ask, what else can I do to support your work? And if the answer again to that is no, just going for let it go for now, because we don't know necessarily when we want to revisit something. And I think to the point about, the space where maybe crisis communications and rapid response overlaps is the moment when you recognize that something is happening in the world that is absolutely changing how people engage with every single issue area. It's engaging how they are it's a political activation moment. And for organizations that have struggled with voicing their opinions and political stance on issues on race, class, gender, sexual orientation, all of that. This is a moment that perhaps this isn't rapid response because you don't want to just say something to pander to the moment, but it is a moment for you to start to reevaluate internally. Why haven't we talked about this before? What can we do to have a genuine conversation, genuine intentions about why we are voicing what we are voicing? And so, just wanting to go back, to the questions before around that Cassidy had mentioned around clapbacks, and just in general call outs, which may at times be the ways that we engage in rapid response. We call out a lawmaker. And the ways that we engage in a moment, we say something pithy, and try to, get our voices into the social media melee. Some of those things I think are very useful, but I think it also, again, helps us to go back and think through what are your actual goals? Because yes, likes and retweets can be, a lot of fun and it can feel really validating about the work that we're doing, but isn't necessarily furthering our overall goal of changing systems, of redistributing power, of, accomplishing whatever it is that our mission is. And so going into the next slide, I just want to talk about what effective rapid response looks like. Like I said before, it looks like knowing when to lead and when to amplify. And with, folks that are trying to convince their organizational leadership of we don't need to weigh in on everything, really stating the fact that it does help our organization to be good partners with other folks that are doing this work. It does help to establish a sense of mutual trust and a stronger ecosystem. None of the work that we do, we accomplish alone, period. So actually having that be a strategy of like, we're going to amplify our partners can be really useful. Next, using the right channels to talk to the right people. Many times I've had to convince an organizational leader that the statement that they want me to write is actually best used for a rally speech, and that this isn't what we need to send to reporters. So again, just thinking through where we need to actually, where we actually need to communicate, who we need to communicate with and how. Identifying the right messengers. And this is where I also, again, say, like, we are doing an amazing job in terms of having directly impacted people speak on the issues that impact them. But we really want to avoid tokenizing and re-triggering people by having them only speak to their lived experiences. The people that we hire on our staff with diverse lived experiences are experts on policy issue areas. If we are not doing the work to establish them as such, we are doing a disservice to our movement. Next, effective rapid response looks like a continuation or course correction of your ongoing work. Like I said before, if we're working on reproductive justice issues and we haven't brought in a race class analysis to them, it's an opportunity for us to do that, to course correct, to acknowledge the ways in which we may have missed the mark in the past. It can also be, again, a continuation of good work and a moment to really have our issue areas jump into the mainstream, have our narrative jump into the mainstream. Lastly, it's about leveraging your resources effectively, really knowing, again, how to use our really big social media platforms for good, how to use our impressive media relationships in service of our movement. And then lastly, effective rapid response looks like knowing when to evaluating the right moment to ramp up or back off. So ramping up, like knowing that, yeah, I wasn't a 72-hour person. We weren't at the front lines, but now we need to get up and geared because we need to jump in and support our partners. Or moments where we need to back off, like, hey, we did a lot of really great preparation work. We were ready to mobilize. We actually can jump back and we're good. It's time to like rest, recuperate, and figure out what we're doing next. And so, Amanda, I would love for you to bring in, again, some of the action plans items that we touched on with our rapid response.
Yeah. And so, we talked about these, but I guess we bring this back up to show that your crisis and your rapid response plans can be the same plans. They can just kind of be these divergent tracks, right? So is this a crisis? Again, something at the core that could harm our organization's ability to do its work, then that's a crisis and we need to kick into the crisis mode. Or is this just something happening in the world that we want to participate in the conversation? Then it's the rapid response channel. But either way, much of this prep can be useful. And I also want to remind you, I saw someone ask in the chat for the slides. I don't have your access to your email or your messengers, anything like that in this app. So at the end, I'm going to give you my email again, and you can the best thing to do is email me and ask for the slides, and I will send them. We'll also try to tweet some out through the Lightbox account as well. But again, the best thing's going to be an email because I'm hoping these are useful too. We definitely want you to have them. So, ultimately our goal is to be the Olivia Popes of our universe and handle things, right? And if you've got that plan in place and you've thought through those decision trees, I think you could consider it handled. However, our work is never done, right? So there is more to do once you've handled the situation.
Yes. And I think this is where I want to tell people that the work that we do can be deeply personal to us. It can touch on our identity. It can touch on our experiences. And that is an added layer of emotional activation. And so, the purpose of running through crisis communication scenarios and really discussing rapid response is being able to do some of that emotional regulation work so that we're not actually, how I would say it, shooting from the hip. We're not writing that very shady tweet. We're not sending that email that is based on the triggered emotions that we have, but we're actually putting our emotions through molasses and thinking through, how does it serve me in this moment to have this conversation? What is it that I'm actually trying to do? And if the answer at any given moment isn't building power, it gives you that moment. The practice scenario gives you that moment to say like, okay, this is not what I should be saying at this moment. So that's why, we want you to, at this moment, really think about how to get your organization to regularly discuss and prepare for rapid response and crisis communications. Use a strategic planning meeting, use a leadership team meeting. Anytime that someone is onboarded, like having them just know the communications protocol so that you avoid the work of you avoid like having to explain something in the moment. It's like it's already embedded there into onboarding. And with any plan that you put into place, like the protocol, you want to revisit it every time that you follow it. One of the things that I learned in doing a lot of rapid response work, again, with communities that are deeply impacted by violence, was that this is really heavy triggering work, which means that it cannot be done by the same people over and over and over again. You need to have a team A, team B, you have to have a tap in, tap out system, because otherwise you are operating from this place of like hurt. And operating from hurt, that is something that we need to obviously give ourselves time to really reckon with, and is at times like not, you do not want to use rapid response and crisis communications to re-trigger people. And so lastly, the thing that we recommend is really robust debriefing. And we offer some questions to think about. Did we respond proportionately? Was our response effective? Did we reach staff and close allies? Crisis communications and rapid response moments can be team building moments. They will determine how people on your staff feel about the organization that they are a part of. So you do need to keep them in mind. Next, what would we do again or do differently? Is there any institutional wisdom gained that needs to be shared more broadly? Y'all, we're a part of a movement, and we're a part, all of our fights may be different. We may be operating at different levels, state, local, regional. We may be doing different issue areas, but our liberation is deeply intertwined. So what we learn about doing this work, we need to share it out. There is no gatekeeping when it comes to navigating right-wing attacks. And so next, we want to talk about how did this impact our ongoing work? Again, if we're on the receiving end of a call out because of, again, the ways that we may have historically marginalized groups, that's a moment to really sit down and think about like, how do we want to change that moving forward and actually making meaningful changes? And then lastly, how can we support our crisis and rapid response teams to rest and recharge? Y'all's leadership needs to really give you time to rest and recharge. That should be a part of these moments in which we do this work, like really thinking through how do we return back to neutral. And so with that, I want to thank you all so much for being here with us and share a bit of our, how to stay in touch with us. So Amanda, read out for the lovely folks your contact information.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that's so small. So you can email me at amanda@lightboxcollaborative.com. And we'll happily send you the slides, or you can you can use the info on the Lightbox Collaborative website. I'm findable, I promise. So you can look me up, and we can find each other and continue this conversation. And I hope this has been a moment of, we talked about crisis, but I hope we did it in a calm way so that you feel that you can do this in a sustainable and safe way to keep your work going, because we really value the work that you do, and we want you to be able to keep doing it for years to come. And we're going to have to be careful with ourselves and with our resources in order to do that. So thanks so much for spending this time with us. If anyone has, I think we have like a minute or two left, if anyone has any following questions. And if not, I look forward to seeing you around and getting your emails. Glad it was helpful. That's what we were hoping to do. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.